Yeah. Hello, I'm Jean James, President of the Jung Society in Canberra. Thank you for joining us tonight for a special evening with David. This evening we're delighted to welcome again David Russell, but before we do that, we acknowledge the Ngunnawal people, the first inhabitants of this place. We honour them for the custodianship of the land on which we gather today. This evening we're delighted to welcome again our friend David Russell. This evening all the way from his home in Sydney. David is quite a favourite presenter here, having visited a number of times over the years. David is a great past president of the Sydney Jung Society. He completed his postgraduate studies and research in psychology at the University of Sydney. Here he was introduced to the writings of Sigmund Freud, unusual for a department of psychology, and developed an ongoing enthusiasm for the history and philosophy of psychology. After a few years in private practice, he moved into an academic career, which culminated in the establishment of the Master of Analytical Psychology degree at the University of Western Sydney. David has currently returned to private practice in Sydney CBD. David will tell the archetypal story of Orpheus and Eurydice, a story of desire and of the imagined world. He will also give his account of a journey into the underworld by Herakles as an illustration of how we might approach the numinous in our daily lives. David will talk for an hour and then we'll move on to discussion and questions and finish before 10 p.m. Note that we'll be sharing this session with people online and recording it for later reference. Let me know if you don't want to be photographed. If you're here online, please remain muted while David is speaking to avoid background noise. Use the Zoom chat button for comments and questions. So now it's David's turn. Thank you, David.
Good. Thank you very much. Hello, everyone.
Hello.
I hope the technology is going to serve us well this evening. I'm here at home in my lounge room at Blackheath in the Blue Mountains, and I've got my glass of water and a cup of coffee to keep me going. So I'll launch into this unusual theme for tonight's talk. I start with a quote from Carl Jung, and I've shaped my thoughts around this quote. So here it is. The main interest, this is Carl Jung speaking, or writing in a letter actually, the main interest of my work is not concerned with the treatment of neurosis, but rather with the approach to the numinous. But the fact is that the approach to the numinous is the real therapy, and inasmuch as you attain to the numinous experience, you are released from the curse of pathology. So what in the world did Jung mean by that? And what is this numinous that he keeps telling us about that we need to approach? I hope tonight I'll shed a bit of light on this question. I certainly hope it gives us a bit to think about. It's my intention anyway. So we can, if we like in a general sense, we can say our desire for the numinous is akin to our desire for some sort of transcendence. But to transcend from what to what? There are many questions to be answered here. Jung argued against the philosopher Aristotle's definition of human nature when Aristotle said, human beings are a rational animal. No, said Jung, not that Aristotle was wrong, but that his definition was incomplete, because he wanted us to think of ourselves as symbolic animals, since the rational was just one expression of our ability to think in symbols. So this is really key to understanding Jung. He's not setting up his writings, his understandings as just rational. He wants them to be symbolic as well. And if we don't take that into account, then he's weird. What he says is just outside mainstream thinking, and certainly outside mainstream psychology. Jung wanted to continually assert that our everyday experiences were shaped by both conscious and unconscious processes. So again, this is critical. Our everyday experiences shaped by both conscious and unconscious processes. The rational approach to life, if that's the only approach we have, is conscious, just conscious. Jung was saying not enough, not enough. He wanted the dynamic link of conscious and unconscious processes. It's impossible to understand Jung, I think, in anything he says, if we don't really appreciate how important it was for him to continually strive to bring these two processes together, conscious and unconscious. And for him, this dynamic unity was what he called his inner life, the dynamic unity of how the unconscious and the conscious interact together. But today, and I think even back then when Jung was writing, speaking, that this notion of unconscious forces, it's pretty abstract. What's unconscious forces? How are we supposed to get a handle on that? How can such a word sustain and nourish our inner life? Because we don't want our inner life just to be an exercise in navel gazing. So my argument tonight is that unconscious forces are felt as an irrepressible need. So this is interesting. The unconscious forces, we feel them as an irrepressible need. We are responding to a need to hope. And specifically to hope in something pretty ineffable, like outside the ordinary. Not hoping for a better life or a happy death or recognition of sorts, but in more subtle and ephemeral experiences. And I reckon they're to do with the give and take of unexpected kindnesses and the give and take of expressions of affection. Those experiences constitute or are expressions of this need to hope in the ineffable, something more than just the mundane. We humans, this is the symbolic bit. We humans, yes, we live with our feet on the ground, but we look to the horizon, we look to the sky, we do both. And looking to the sky, we imagine extraordinary things. Now, this is the thing for Jung. Time and time again, he wanted to say, I am not a theologian. Jung always referred to himself as a psychologist. And for him, that meant something different to psychologists as we understand them today. For Jung, being a psychologist meant that he attended to the psychological experience, the experience of the soul in action, the soul in action. So not just our cognitions or our sensations or our behaviours, but soul in action. So that was the old Greek meaning of the word psychology, soul in action. So his concern primarily was the desire for the numinous, the desire for transcendence, and less so for the numinous as an object of the desire. So the desire, the feeling, the need is where he wanted to place his emphasis. So my interpretation of Jung's attitude was that he valued the process of striving more than any imagined point of arrival. Again, this is quite different to writers today who want us to focus on what we can achieve. For Jung, it was the actual being in the process, the desire, the longing. So placing the approach to the numinous at the center of our way of thinking and feeling and behaving, this is what we have to do. It's impossible to do it all the time, but if we do it some of the time, fantastic. It's more of a quality than a quantity. And I want to assert that there are three major ways of engaging with the world, or to put it a bit differently, three different worlds to engage in. There's the world of our sense perception, our touch, our sight, taste, so on. The world of intelligibility, how we make sense of our experiences, and the forgotten third, the imaginal world. We just don't give it the same prominence as we do to the world of how we make things meaningful, intelligent world, or the world of the senses. Jung had a special understanding of the notion of what an image was. He considered it an order of reality no less real than the physical reality or the intellectual reality. This was his third way, the way of soul making. So the imaginal world for Jung was an order of reality no less real than the one we put our feet on and touch and taste. And another quote from Jung. Jung described an image as a condensed expression of the psychic situation as a whole. So it's different to what we just see with our eyes. It's an expression of the unconscious as well as the conscious situation at the moment. So for Jung, a psychological image, again, was this union of conscious and unconscious that made a psychological image. So when you saw a bird sitting on a branch, it wasn't just what your eyes saw. There was an unconscious sense of something or other that came into that experience of seeing the bird. That is what Jung means by imaginal. Each time we dwell in the imaginal, we make soul. So my approach to the imaginal world, to the numinous, this third way, will be to use figures from Greek mythology. So they're really imaginal. They never really existed. They don't exist, but they have a connection to us. And the English poet William Blake, he emphasized this meaning of the imaginal in that famous 4 lines of his: to see the world in a grain of sand and a heaven in a wildflower, hold infinity in the palm of your hand and eternity in an hour. Each one of those 4 lines does this: to see the world in a grain of sand. So you have the grain of sand, you look at it and you see a world. You have a wildflower, you look at it, you see a heaven. You can hold infinity in the palm of your hand and eternity in an hour. This is what Jung was getting at when he said the language of the soul is constructed, made up of images, psychological images. And for those who are interested in counseling and psychotherapy, for Jung, the aim of psychotherapy was to help the client build a bridge between the firm ground of everyday reality and what I'm calling the ineffable, the imaginal. All psychotherapy, as we understand it, is therapy of the soul. It's a double journey. So you have the worried waters of everyday life, and you have the deep motionless, noiseless waters of the unconscious, a double journey. That was what Jung was trying to get at, the double journey, not just helping people feel better, less anxious, less depressed. No, he wanted the double journey. We humans in our daily life, we know that things go wrong and they go wrong again. And yet there is need for hope. And I'm calling it an irrepressible need to hope. An Irish poet this time will help me get the imagery. It's a little more, help us get more in touch with it. And so William Butler Yeats describes this process of being a human being when he says the words, "And what rough beast its hour comes round at last, slouches towards Bethlehem to be born." So he's saying that we humans, we're the rough beast. And our hour comes round at last when we recognize our life, our place, our meaning in life. And here we are, we don't march triumphantly towards Bethlehem, we slouch towards Bethlehem to be born. So we're not just treading water in a Jungian understanding of psychology, we're slouching towards Bethlehem to be born. The process of slouching is the dynamic of being engaged. Jung used a lot of biblical words, and we don't want to take them literally because that wasn't Jung's intention. His intention was that we take them symbolically. And so our slouching towards Bethlehem is not some sort of rebirth. It's not some notion of the end of times. No, it's hope in action. It's that hope in the subtle and ephemeral experiences of the give and take of kindnesses and the give and take of affection or love. And we do these small acts of hope, not in some grandiose fashion, but rather slouching towards Bethlehem to be born. In Jungian psychology, gods and goddesses are viewed as necessary fictional guides in the service of the soul. So that's why we talk a lot about Greek mythology. They're necessary guides, fictional guides in the service of the soul. They're not to be believed in, but to be imagined as psychological guides in the never-ending saga of soul-making. But there's nothing precious about Greek mythology. One could use any mythology, Indian mythology, for example. Self-Pacific mythology, whatever. The point is the symbolic life and the action of the need we have to find guides that help us in this journey of the soul. So I'll begin my reference with this archetypal story of Orpheus and Eurydice, and it's a story of desire, big time, and the imaginal world. So like all mythic stories or symbolic stories, you don't listen to them as trying to understand, you just allow yourself to be taken away with the imagery. So here we go. One day, Orpheus was in the woods playing his lyre that his father had given him when he noticed a beautiful wood nymph, Eurydice. Eurydice had heard Orpheus playing the lyre and she was drawn to the beautiful music. Likewise, Orpheus was drawn to the beauty of Eurydice. It was love at first sight. Eurydice was a beautiful nymph, and her beauty was apparent to more than just Orpheus. A shepherd named Aristotle had noticed Eurydice's beauty and wanted her for himself. So he hid in the bushes and waited for her. His plan was to kill Orpheus and take Eurydice as his own. As Eurydice and Orpheus neared Aristeus, he jumped out of the bushes, but was unable to kill Orpheus. Instead, Orpheus grabbed Eurydice and they began running through the woods. As they ran, Aristeus chased them. Orpheus held Eurydice's hand as they ran until he fell. He felt her fall and slip out of his hand. So you can imagine them running through the woods, being chased. He's holding her hand, and then he felt her fall and slip out of his hands. When he turned round, Orpheus saw that Eurydice had stepped on a venomous snake that had bitten her. She was dying, and Orpheus was unable to save her. Eurydice died in the woods from a venomous snake bite and descended into the underworld. Orpheus then asked his father, who was Apollo, who had given him the lyre and the love of music, asked Apollo to help him go to the underworld and retrieve his lover. So Apollo went to Hades, the god of the underworld, and told him that Orpheus wanted to visit him to request the return of his lover, Eurydice. Hades agreed. So with his lyre in hand, Orpheus made his way to the underworld and found Hades. Orpheus played his lyre and sang to Hades and all those in the underworld. Everyone in the underworld was moved by the beautiful song and the music that Orpheus played for Eurydice. So Hades acquiesced to Orpheus's desire for Eurydice. However, he told Orpheus that he could look at Eurydice when she finally entered the light of the upper world, but he could not look at her while she was in the dark, in the underworld. So we've got to get this clear in our mind. He could take Eurydice to the above world, but he could not look at her until she entered the light of the upper world. Hades warned that if he turned and looked at Eurydice while she was still in the dark, she would be condemned to the underworld forever. So Orpheus was overjoyed that his plan had worked, and he began to lead Eurydice out of the underworld. And as they were nearing the upper world, Orpheus could hear the land of the living above him and could not contain his excitement. It was a beautiful cold day like today, and he was just overwhelmed by the beauty of the world. So Orpheus finally entered the light in the upper world and turned around to embrace his lover, but she had not emerged from the underworld. She was still in the dark when Orpheus turned around to hug her. At that moment, Eurydice was condemned to the underworld forever. And so, forevermore, Orpheus longs for his Eurydice and uses his music making to express his longing. We, humans here on earth, need to do the same. With or without music, we express our longing for our Eurydice, our ineffable desire. If we fail to do this consciously, Jung would say, then these unconscious forces will take control over us and they will act on us and we will become, as it were, bewitched. So opening ourselves to unconscious forces is what Jung meant by his phrase, approaching the numinous. And approaching the numinous is our journey into the underworld. So this is the, if you like, the secret of success. Opening ourselves to the unconscious forces is what Jung meant by his phrase, approaching the numinous. And Orpheus, if you like, is so many operas and musicals and movies have been made about Orpheus and Eurydice. And it's a comment on our human need to long, to be in this state of longing, but not just to be paralyzed, to make music, make art, make gardening, make whatever it is, walking out into nature. And we do it with a longing for the ineffable, and we actualize it with our little acts of unexpected kindness and our little acts of affection. So the next reference to Greek mythology and the underworld is a story I've half made up myself and half brought in other stories from mythology. And I've called it Herakles at the Gates of the Underworld. Now, I've given Heracles a female gender, not Hercules, which is what the late Greeks and the Romans called this human god figure. Heracles. And my reason for this is that the word Heracles means the glory of Hera. So in more ancient Greek mythology, we had Heracles, the glory of Hera. Subsequently, when things got a lot more patriarchal, Heracles was changed into Hercules, the hero. But the original meaning of Heracles, and for that matter, Hercules, was that they were the hero who was between us mortals and the gods. The sort of person who could bridge the difference between the mortals and the immortals. So here's the story of Heracles. She just had her 14th birthday. She's out in the bush picking a bunch of wildflowers. It's early winter. All of a sudden, the earth beneath her feet opens up and she falls down, down. Then at the gates of the underworld, she's confronted by this ferocious dog, Cerberus, guarding the entrance to the netherworld. At the feet of this ferocious dog is a perfect pearl in the shape of a teardrop and the size of a golf ball. But Cerberus is a monstrous watchdog with 3 heads, all of which are terrifying to us humans. Heads of snakes grew from his back, and he had a serpent's tail. Cerberus devoured anyone who tried to enter or tried to escape the underworld. Heracles was both drawn to and fearful of Cerberus. She wanted that pearl and she feared for her death. Retreat from the gates of the underworld seemed to be the only possible option. So, slowly but reluctantly, she found her way back to the above world. And as the years progressed, she never forgot either the beauty of the pearl or the terrifying nature of the guard dog. For 7 long years, every winter, she would wander the bush gathering wildflowers for her home. And every year she would long to see the pearl, to hold the pearl, to have the pearl. Then on her 21st birthday, on her regular walk through the bush, the earth again opened up and down into the underworld she fell. When approaching the underworld, Heracles meets Orpheus. Remember Orpheus? Orpheus is our nature god whose music can tame the wild beasts and delight the inanimate rocks and trees. Orpheus knows about longing. After all, he lost Eurydice when they had just fallen in love. Heracles and Orpheus are, each in their own way, filled with longing. Heracles for the divine pearl, Orpheus for Eurydice. Orpheus with his lyre, his music and his singing has the power to enchant Cerberus and thus quieten his ferocity. Now Heracles is able to lean over and take the pearl she so desired. In her hands, in her possession, the pearl turns into a nothing. Just as Orpheus lost Eurydice by looking back, Heracles lost the pearl by wanting to possess it. On Heracles' return to the above world, she is now old enough to understand. Understanding is the hallmark of her new relationship with daily reality. It's an understanding and acceptance of human experience. So it's deep understanding. It's understanding that is comprised of the desire for the mutual shaping of love, the desire for stability, the desire for companionship. These three things make human experience what's so important to us. The mutual shaping of love, desire for stability, desire for companionship. And the key word again is desire, desire, desire. It's not that we get there always, or that we are not satisfied until we do. The story tells us that the story of Heracles, she got the pearl, it disappeared. Then she came up to the above world. What she got was understanding. So the dream of acquiring the pearl of unspeakable beauty remains and is now a source of motivational energy for her. She can get on with her life, desiring love, desiring stability, desiring companionship, but not needing the pearl. The romance of a ready turnabout has been put into the background because that was, for those years from 7 to 21, she wanted the pearl. The belief that love, especially love as a romantic idea, has long gone. It is the doing of love, the fashioning of stability, the making of companionship that now makes the difference. We know of this experience of Heracles because it is our experience. This is where the myth becomes our reality. We have to learn that desire is the key theme. Desire for these human things, companionship, stability, love. Let's now just explore a little bit of the imagery of this myth. Let's look at the above world. What do we mean by the above world? Well, it's the world that we live in our everyday life. It's where we are subject to the forces of the ego and the life of the senses. It's our conscious world. The below world is the world of our dreaming, our daytime reveries, and our imaginings. It is largely the sphere of unconscious forces, of mystery, of the unknown. So what about this journey into the underworld? What's so important about that? The story tells us that Heracles, our heroine, had to fall into the underworld. There's a necessity of falling, and that's a telling necessity. Heracles didn't choose to leave the above world and go to the underworld. It was a matter of necessity. And Heracles was experiencing the force of necessity. In everyday life, we get into this fantasy state that I should be able to live free of necessity and be free to have more time, get more things done. I shouldn't have to suffer like this. This is our fantasy. But Jung again, to quote Jung, here he is. He's writing a foreword to actually a book of literature that someone else had written. And he says, it is a psychological rule that when an archetype, like the one we're talking about of longing and of the underworld, of the numinous, when an archetype has lost its metaphysical grounding, it becomes identified with the conscious mind of the individual. which is influenced and refashioned in its own way by the ego. And since the archetype always possesses a certain numinosity, the integration of the numen generally produces an inflation of the subject. So we get a swelled, if we forget about the numinous and the mythological story, and we just want the archetype, we're going to get a swelled head, and we're going to be in a big dilemma with our ego. We're going to be in trouble, capital T trouble. And our whole society today has gone to the rational mind, and it's led us to think that we should be masters of our personal universe. The implication is, if I don't have sort of control over my experiences, then I must be going mad. But Jung went on to say, after that last quote, that our mental sickness is somewhat a consequence of the success of the Western mind. How about that? Our mental sickness is somewhat a consequence of the success of our Western mind. His actual words, in isolating itself into its own sphere and in severing it from the primordial oneness of the universe. So in other words, we've lost touch, he's saying. In our Western world, we're so successful with our rational mind, we've lost touch with what he called the primordial oneness of the universe, our engagement with nature, with mystery, with uncertainty, with the unknown. And so he gave us this understanding that the gods are no longer in heaven, but now are manifest in our psychopathology. That our gods express themselves through our depression and our anxiety and whatever else, our addiction. The gates of the underworld, what's they supposed to represent? Well, the gates represent that psychological space between conscious forces and unconscious forces, or if you prefer, the ego and the soul. And it's that difficult space between those two where we often find ourselves. And so the gates of the underworld become a good image for us to be with and to then elaborate in our own mind. What about the guard dog, Cerberus? This helps us understand that the rational mind cannot quieten the forces of the unconscious. Try as we might to understand what these unconscious forces are doing in our dreams, for example, in our daytime reveries, for example, beyond us. And the guard dog is just saying, no, this is the symbol. The rational mind cannot quieten me. I am ferocious. I am destroying anyone who enters or anyone who tries to exit the underworld. We need to remind ourselves and to accept the unconscious forces at work in our daily life. So in overall sense, the myth is telling us that there's a certain, if you like, attitude or disposition that is required to approach the numinous. An attitude of inquiry, of openness, of questioning. What is my soul asking of me? How do I make soul from my dream life, my reveries, my imaginings? An inquiring attitude. We know that approaching the numinous is not some sort of fantasy or idealization. Jung is not implying magic, some sort of sleight of hand. And very interestingly, he doesn't give us much guidance. There's no 12-step program. He's virtually saying, you just can't do it. You just can't actualize the drive, the insatiable longing. You have to find your own back door. And Jung devised his own with his painting of the mandalas and his active imagination. He never gave up. His persistence and consistency of doing the work is the hallmark of Jung's life, really. Jung's back door, we need to find our own, but his back door is the fundamental belief that he had in the power of images. Images, he kept saying, are the language of the soul. And this was his profound understanding and his go-to strategy for his life and his work. We know his active imagination has become especially useful, and it allows us to go on that open-ended journey into the imaginal, where we create images that are outside. We create them, but they're created outside of our conscious awareness. They come from our dreams, or from reading good literature, or from roaming in the countryside ourselves. We have to be very humble in doing this. James Hillman, who reminded us often about this, he said, the devil's power seems to grow not in the shadow, but from our light. The devil gains when we lose touch with our own darkness, when we lose sight of our own destructiveness and self-deceptions. Now, this is a pretty humbling experience. This is not some glowing journey into the bliss, eternal bliss. The devil's power, again, mythologically, the devil's power seems to grow not in our shadow, but from our light, when we think we're in touch with the secret to success. We've got it, we've got the message, and we don't need to keep up the work. Jung wanted to remind us that there's a hell of a difference between perfection and completeness. And what he meant by that was completeness was the sense of integration of mind, body, spirit. Perfection, well, the angels can pursue that, not us. It's an ego project. We've got to watch all the time that our reading of, say, Jungian an ego project in itself. It's not wholeness as the goal, but it's really the soul making. When we are in psychotherapy or counseling, we work soul to soul, not ego to ego, not rational mind to rational mind. And Jung's words were, psychotherapy is an encounter between two psychic spheres confronting one another in their totality. That is, two human beings, the fullness of human beings, mind, body, spirit, not just thoughts or behaviours. For Jung, and he keeps reminding us, a technique is always a soulless mechanism. Our unconscious drivers are always there, knowingly or unknowingly. There was Jung's working assumption that the psyche is whole in itself. The wholeness is present there at the start. And his words were, we must not succumb to anything at all, not even to good. We must be aware of thinking of good and evil as opposites. Psyche is whole. Ego seduces us to seek a sense of purpose, the desire for achievements. So in conclusion, for my prepared bit, and then I'll be happy to do some questions. In preparing this talk, I have found myself continually groping for a handrail that will hold me steady enough so that I can be ambitious enough to approach the numinous. Just as Jung said we have to do, knowingly or unknowingly. The poet Rumi always offers us wisdom on our journey. So here's his little 4 lines, the quatrain. Rumi, ancient poet, says, I am so small, I can barely be seen. How can this great love be inside me? Look at your eyes, they are small, but they see enormous things. Only then can I see, to use Yeats's world, the world in a word, the world in a grain of sand and a heaven in a wildflower. Only then can we do that integration. Okay, that's enough for me, my prepared spiel, and now I'm happy to take any questions or comments, reflections.
Oh, okay. It's pretty spectacular. David, I'd like to thank you very much from the heart and from the soul, and to say it's just been amazing for you to come on the large screen. If it hadn't been for my 70th birthday last year, we wouldn't even know this technology, because we had to bring in a lot of people from the state. So we've been able to bring this, the technology, and bring you here tonight at our meeting room, which is pretty amazing technology, isn't it? So we'd like to open the floor up to questions for you, and thank you very much. It's just amazing, and particularly on a really windy night that we've all been overcoming here too. Thank you.
Thank you so much, David, for your. Am I muted or
No, you're good. I can hear you.
Oh, okay. Thank you so much for your talk. It really hits me in the heart. And I'm just wondering, just in relation to the unconscious, it really frightens me to go there. I know I need to, and I feel that maybe it's the shadow that is stopping me from doing it. I really don't want to go into a therapeutic whole thing, but you were mentioning that Jung, the way that Jung did it was through like visualizations and his red book basically. But you know, where do you start when it's the shadow that's stopping you? I don't want to go into it therapeutically. I'm not asking for that. I'm just wondering. The unconscious is something that really scares me.
And fair enough. So it should.
Yeah. And the underworld. Yeah.
The tradition, the Jungian tradition, is to use dream imagery. So you wake up in the morning, a dream has woken you up, something has startled you, and you wake up, but you can remember an image from the dream, or 1 or 2 images. Then you can just write those down briefly or talk them into a recorder, your phone, and that's the start. That's bringing together your conscious life, your ego, and unconscious material. And then, if you like, your consciousness is led by the imagery. So let's say the image is a swimming pool, and you and a friend are sitting at the edge of the pool. That's the beginning. And as it were, you take that out of the dream and figuratively speaking, you put it on the kitchen table. And then you walk around it. This is the gentle Jungian approach. Walk around it if you like, in your imagination. Look at it from below and above, and then ask it a question. What are you swimming for? What are you, your person in the dream, your dream image? What are you trying to tell me that I cannot hear with my ordinary ears? And you leave it there. You don't expect an answer, but you've begun the process. And then what happens, generally speaking, that as you focus on that image of yourself and your friend by the pool, it changes, it moves into another image of some sort. And then you consciously follow that. And you keep following it until it sort of wears itself out, or it feels in a way complete. So this is a way of managing consciously the unconscious material. And it's not going to get you into any trouble. It needs to be done with the sort of attitude that I was talking about, humility, not trying to control, make stuff happen. No, you just gently let that happen, and you'll get better at it. And it's meant for us all, because we all have this capacity to dream, which is the unconscious coming into our conscious life such that it wakes us up. We're aware of the dream, and then we're free, or if we want to, activate or elaborate that dream imagery. Good start.
Very much, David.
Good.
You can hear me okay? Can you hear me?
Yep, I can hear you.
So I suppose David's still turned down, but just.
Well, you have to speak up so we can hear you.
Okay. So it was a wonderful address, David, and just let me collect my thoughts. I just took some notes on what you were talking about in terms of Jung's understanding of human being as more than rational, and entering into the symbolic, and this whole concept of imagery as a third form of awareness, I suppose, alongside the rational and other forms of awareness. And so when you talk about this sense of the ineffable and the imaginal, it reminds me of, it makes me think of a couple of topics. Firstly, the sort of that psychological idea of the distinction between left brain and right brain as an image of the analytic world versus the creative. But it also reminds me strongly of Carl Jung's interest in astrology. And astrology it's a topic it's really, it reminds me a bit of Cerberus as something that's just quite dangerous at the margins of our society. And yet it's so full of these sorts of images that you were talking about. The way the planets in astrology, Pluto and Uranus and Neptune, have got this deep numinous imagery of a sense of the unity of the cosmos. But it's a way of thinking that's just anathema to our modern rational society. And so the way Jung picks up on that sense of the imaginal and symbolic is something that many of these sorts of mystical traditions have long been very much open to, but they're ideas that have been closed off by our empirical scientific culture. So I'm just interested in your reflections on those issues, please.
I think it brings home an important distinction, and that is, do we take astrology literally, or do we take it mythically, metaphorically? And the Jungian approach, my understanding of it, of course, I can only speak from my own place, is that we need to understand it mythically. So again, these are guiding fictions, not to be believed in, but to be followed imaginatively. So this is, and you're dead right about our Western society. We find this, if you like, prescription. How do I follow something imaginatively and not take it literally? Like, tell me what my future is. Tell me what my past has been. Tell me. That is taking it literally. We want concrete answers. We want to be in control. And Jung was always saying, no, it's not the right. You don't seek control. You seek soul making. And soul making is this imaginative or imaginal disposition in which we see a heaven in a wildflower. That's when we know we're getting there, when we can actually, just for a second, just shift our orientation from, oh, it's a beautiful flower, to something, yes, and it's something ineffable as well. That is the move. So it's not like saying it's only can ever be a wildflower, or that astrology can only ever be a mythology. No, we use these. We are to use these things and gain sustenance and from them. But we've lost touch. We've lost the facility to be touched by the imaginal, and we drive continuously to make sense. I need to get hold of. I need to master the art. I need to fit it into a framework of understanding, because that's what we've been taught. And us in the Jungian tradition are just reminding, if you like, Western society, don't overcook it. Don't be so lopsided. Open yourself to unconscious forces, to the imaginal world, and your life will be all the richer for it, because we're made that way.
So Blake's image of heaven in a wild flower goes back to the idea of the Hermetic tradition of ancient philosophy, the idea of as above, so below, this sense that we're connected to the universe. And it's this sense of connection to the universe that I think is a key to the sort of mystical element in Jung. And I'm just wondering how you, and that loss of that Hermetic tradition, which really was at the foundation of modern science, because Isaac Newton picked up on that Hermetic idea with the theory of gravity. And yet this sense of everything being connected to everything else, it's got a mystical quality that's not
is really an effort. Yeah, the mystical quality. That's right.
Our life today.
We can't comprehend it in the way we.
Sorry, David, you just need to repeat yourself.
Oh, we can't comprehend the mystery. We have to be subject to it. We have to be humble in the presence of it, because we can't, to think we could study an earlier tradition or even the Jungian tradition in order to get control or manage, no. All the time is we live with this disposition of openness, open heart, open mind, and allow the experience to, as it were, be fulfilling. The moment we try to master a tradition, I would say it's an ego project. That's fine if we're in a scientific realm, but in a psychological realm, understanding psychology as working with soul making, then mastery is not the name of the game. Competency or whatever else is not the name of not the main game. Mm.
Just a point here, this mic only feeds the Zoom, so you need to speak up really loudly to make yourself heard within the room. I can't give you the output from Zoom because then we get feedback.
Oh, David, thank you very much. That was great. And I guess my only thought is, the importance of doing nothing, it seems, and we don't do much of nothing. Our nothing time is filled with social media or it's some kind of distraction, or it just seems that we don't value nothing time, which is really when you get that default network just kind of ticking over, and that just seems to be something that we really need to do every day, or have down times in the week where we just give ourselves the space.
Yes.
When images come up, because it just, I just find I don't give myself, I used to have a lot of that time, but I don't have much anymore.
I think there's an important distinction here to make, and that is, sometimes we just need to let go and abandon ourselves to nothing. And when we go to sleep, for example, is one of those times. Another time is nothing with like a capital N, when we open our heart and open our mind to, this is where the ineffable comes in, to ... That's an act of soul making. That's different to doing nothing. That is the disposition of openness and engagement. It might look like and sound like doing nothing, but it's not. And we need to, I think, stress what you're saying, give importance to this experience of opening our heart, opening our mind. When we open our heart to love, we open our mind to the unknown. And that's an active thing, it's a verb. We open, and we have to do that consciously. We can't do it all the time, but a little bit of the time is fantastic. Every now and then, just to be able to do it is the facility we need to keep polished.
Good day. Thank you again. I wonder on this line of doing nothing, have you had much experience with young people, even like primary school? We're told all along that daydreaming, is for losers and useless waste of time and so forth. And, teenagers and the new age people and so forth have gone into meditation, and a lot of us have different traditions who value that. But pre-teenagers, I think there's really no history in our education or cultural life of valuing that or trying to inculcate some sort of a valued period of daydreaming or doing nothing for very young people. I'm wondering if there's any knowledge or experience or theory much of that working away with.
Again, I think it's a start. The daydreaming is a starting point. It might go nowhere. We might just stand still and daydream. But if we trust, again, this is trusting the process, trusting the dynamic. You go into the daydream and you let it take you somewhere unknown, and you keep following it for a period of time, like maybe 10 seconds, anything. And that's a facility. That becomes a developed skill. So then your consciousness is taken on a little journey. Short one, but a marvelous one. And that's a learned skill. And not just, the trouble is often, the daydreaming becomes just a matter of small-time fantasy. It doesn't open us, we don't open ourselves and follow into it and learn this skill of imagining as an active soul-making quality. So we need to encourage our young people and ourselves to start with the daydream, start with an image that comes through the daydream, and then actively work with it. Actively work with it to make soul. So that there's some sense of moving towards heaven in the wildflower, moving towards a Bethlehem of sorts, moving towards infinity. That is the dynamic that Jung and Freud, for that matter, were trying to assert when they called their work depth psychology or dynamic psychotherapy. It's the dynamic, it's the desire, the energy that comes in the movement, not in treading water or going into a zone of just daydreaming. So encourage little kids to play with their toys, play with their dolls, little cars, and encourage the bigger landscape, not to poo-hoo their activity as being a waste of time, because it's active. The trouble with a lot of the games that are available today on the screen is that they're too passive. They don't do that active soul making. They are just always starting points. And the imagery is created for you. The drama is created for you, more or less. And it's not that opening your heart and opening your mind, which is what our desire is.
Yes, thank you. That's a very positive sort of view on it.
Thanks very much for your talk, David. I see my own interpretation of the start of the talk is parallel worlds, conscious and subconscious, connecting with each other with images and visualization and so forth.
Yep.
But within the two worlds connecting to each other within ourselves.
Yep. Yep.
So you gave that much importance.
The interaction
doesn't go, doesn't leave a void. Is that void filled by the connection between those parallel lines of conscious and subconscious?
My understanding of your question or your statement too is that we often keep the two worlds a bit too separate. Actually, they're experiential worlds that we experience, and we need a dynamic interaction, a conversation is what Jung would call it, between the two. Not to conflate them into one, but to keep them separate, but in relationship. So that there's what I referred to, the gates of the underworld, there's a space there. You're not in, you're not out, as it were. And that space is between the conscious and the unconscious. And there we have the freedom to say, I'll open myself more fully to unconscious imagery right now. I'll just take a moment to let myself be swept away by a particular image. I'll go with it. And that then is, that in a real sense, is a conversation between the conscious world and the unconscious world. You're trusting both of them, and you're giving them an honoured place respectively, because one, they're different forces. In the dynamic sense, they're different energies. They shape our experience, but differently. And we have the two working together, sweet. When the two are in conflict or one gets given the flick, we're in trouble. Either way, if we give our conscious world the flick, we're in trouble. If we give our unconscious world the flick, we're in trouble.
I'll ask another question. Another provider, the Cherry. David, thanks. Yeah. I was interested in the David James Hillman quote about the devil finds not from in our shadows but from our light. Now, I
Yes.
asked you to speak on behalf of James Hillman, but I wonder if you could say, mindful of the fact that we don't want to be here necessarily until breakfast time on this question.
We don't.
Your idea of the devil, wherein lies the devil in our Western society?
James Hillman, one of his characteristics was that he went into this extreme place with his language and imagery. He wanted to make a point, and he would exaggerate and use dramatic language and dramatic imagery to get his point across. So his point here was that when we feel like we're on top of things, like there's a place for most things and everything's in their place most of the time, that is a very sunny place. That's a place of light. You look around and you feel, yeah, my life's good. The devil plays havoc with that in imagery, the devil, that force of the unconscious comes in and disrupts. And in the imagery of the myth, the world opens up and we fall, the earth opens up and we fall down into the gates of the underworld. Because it's too sweet, as they say these days. Our human experience is that things go wrong, and they go wrong again. And that's a fertile place. That's a place of shadow, if you like. Why do I keep doing stuff that is upsetting me? Why do I keep doing stuff that gets me into trouble, for example, or not doing what I know I need to do? That is a place of vulnerability, but is a place, if we open ourselves to that, then we're at the gates of the underworld, and we are approaching, in Jung's language, the numinous, and we can then open ourselves because we're feeling vulnerable to unconscious forces. The ego likes us to be strong and feel we don't need the unconscious, just don't need to go there. Too complex, too waffly, don't need to. Things are pretty good as they are. And that's denying half of our human experience then.
Yes, thank you. John.
Hello, David. I'm John. And
hello, John.
the question about conscious, unconscious, to what extent is that unconscious peopled by this whole string of generational, our long history of forebears
Yeah.
that influence us without us even realizing it or taking account of it. Thank you.
Yes, yes, a very grand question, and of course it is to a great extent. But how in the world can we comprehend it? I don't know. I think we just sit humbly in the presence, knowing that our ancestors have been before us, and that our experience is largely shaped by their experience. That what we have gloriously called our free will these days is shaped by thousands of years of humanity, both Homo sapiens and other humans, our cousins who were humans but weren't the sapiens type. They're there too. They're shaping our daily experience. And we can only sit humbly, as I say, and acknowledge that if we try to get a handle on it and hold that handle very tenaciously, then it becomes an ego project again. And so I think it's just one of those wonderful things where, again, if we sit in nature and we bring that recognition that we are the outcome, if you like, of thousands of years of ancestral work, experience, literally experience, shaped by their prior generations' experience. It's pretty, it's holding infinity in the palm of your hand then. It's the stuff of poetry, if you like, the stuff of dreaming. But we can't manage it as if it was a garden plot or a book to read.
Yes, further to that point, I was writing about my life and biography. Further to that point, I was writing my autobiography, and I realized that instead of the pronoun I that I used throughout, I should say we, when I considered all that influence of all these words that uses these things.
Yes, I like that. That's right. Very accurate, very accurate.
David, my name is Mary, and okay. So now, okay. I used to conduct a lot of workshops on personal power and control. Okay. Okay, my question is, I used to give people creative visualization exercises in which they automatically receive messages from the higher consciousness or the subconsciousness, whatever people are comfortable with. And I wonder if you equate that to daydreaming, because it isn't imaging and you're not asleep, but they do have powerful messages, as in a dream state.
Yes, I think what your workshops were opening people up. You were inviting them to open themselves up to unconscious forces. You offered the invitation. Some accepted that invitation more than others, but you created a space, a fertile space for them to engage and elaborate their imagery. And there's got to be unconscious processes shaping those experiences because of the manner in which you conducted the workshop. Yep.
Now, do you equate it to daydreaming?
No, daydreaming, I think, as we generally understand it, is an equivalent to sort of standing still. It's not moving adequately into the action phase of the dreaming. You know, Jung's notion of soul making, it's a verb. And so daydreaming is while we can just allow ourselves, as normally understood, the daydream, we just allow ourselves to have a moment apart from the busyness of the world. But we're not using the dream material in a way you were using it in the workshop. You were allowing people to go and follow their imagery and elaborate them. That gets beyond the daydreaming then. That's getting into what Jung called active imagination. Yeah, the language gets mixed up because you use the word dreaming in different ways. Yeah.
Thank you.
Anyone got more thoughts or questions for David? Here we go.
So, David, one of the themes that Carl Jung picked up that relates to these ideas is the importance of non-Western traditions. And I'm thinking especially here of the shamanistic traditions, where these themes of active imagination extend into practices like lucid dreaming, where there are things that are seen as ridiculous within our supposedly rational modern world, but which have an immense tradition in non-Western traditions. I'd just be interested in your thoughts on that aspect of it.
Yep. Jung looked widely, and as you said, into one area was the shamanistic tradition, but he looked in many places. I feel his intention was for himself. He wanted to get help from these other traditions in terms of impulses and knowledge and validation of his own processes. See, I think Jung trusted his own processes enormously. And we see that, in the Red Book, for example. He trusted his imaginative life, but like he remained a vulnerable human being, and he wanted, what did other people do? How did they manage this inner life in its expression to the community? How did they find it useful to bring the inner life into the outer life? And so he studied the traditions, I think largely to validate his own belief in himself and the way he did it for himself, because I think his psychology was essentially for himself, about himself. And as far as that be put forward, other people could say, yes, I'll do something similar to what Jung was doing. And so we can say the same thing now. I can do something similar to what the shamans were doing. And I'll see if that validates my own inner life experience. It's that bit that's critical. We all need to trust our own human experience, especially that internal experience. And then we look for ways of validating it, sort of getting a sense of its truthfulness, validating it. And we'll look in different places. Jung is a particularly rich place to look, to validate our own experience. See, the basic assumption is that we all do this. We all have an inner life. We all have a rich, imaginative life. Sometimes it gets us into trouble. Sometimes we don't know how to use it. Sometimes we ignore it totally. But if there are ways that help us integrate it, fantastic. And the shamanistic tradition helped Jung integrate his own inner life experiences. And then he could write about them with a greater sense of conviction and truth. And that's what we all need. So it's not like we become disciples of any particular tradition. We learn from them, in order to increase the trust we have in our own inner experience and our own inner work. I think this is important. Yeah.
And so part of the hollowness of the conventional Christian tradition has been an excessive focus on literalism, that in saying, for example, that the Bible is telling us about what actually happened in the past, rather than giving us stories that we can use creatively to find our own sense of meaning today. Is that something that you agree with?
I mean, I grew up a Roman Catholic, very dedicated, loyal, passionate Catholic, and I prayed to the Virgin Mary religiously, like literally, and it worked for me. And so it worked in a number of ways. It gave me conviction that there was another, an ineffable world, if you like. Again, not to take that literally, but I actually got into the business of praying. I did that soul-making activity of engaging or bridge building between the ordinariness of my life as a kid and this extraordinary world I knew nothing about. I was continually building the bridges. So it worked for me. When I became more adult, into my late 20s, I then realized that I couldn't take it literally. I had to then see it as a rich mythology of our Western tradition, following the Greeks. And there was always a problem, again, this ego problem. We take it literally and the ego comes in, and I found the truth, sort of ego problem. I have found the truth, and we're in deep trouble. And that's why Jung was saying, I am not a theologian. Don't ask me theological questions. I don't give theological answers. I give psychological answers. I give answers that have to do with the inner life, not some dogma or scriptural understanding. Yeah.
Yeah, perhaps we should be just about finishing up. But tell me if this is how it's going, David. But now we've got the privilege of your online company. I wonder if you could give us a few words on the future of Jungian studies. I mean, you're a Jungian from way back. We know you quite well from multiple visits here. And we hear from people in academia that Jungian studies are sort of passe, and other more modern schools of thought are taking over and so forth. But nearly all perhaps of what you've said tonight seems to me to be of pretty universal significance. And I'd be sort of astonished to hear that people are saying, oh no, that doesn't apply, because, you know, we're dealing with sort of fairly basic truths here.
Yep. Good. It's a comment on our where we've come to in our Western society in the last few hundred years, primarily. But it's Jung has no place in the academic world in psychology or in philosophy. Literary studies, perhaps, yes. Film studies, yes, perhaps. But Freud gets a lot more coverage. But Jung has influenced a number of famous movie makers. But he's been pushed to the margins by our culture. Our rational culture has no place for Jung. They don't find his writings, his insights useful, because the mindset is in a cocoon, in a rational cocoon. And the place where you'd think he would be read in psychology or in philosophy, no. And he is judged to be wacky, mystical, and have nothing to offer. nothing useful to offer. Now, I disagree totally, obviously, with that, but there we are. And we live in a world which is shaped by forces. They're terribly rational forces, conscious forces, where we believe we have a problem, we need to get on top of it, and then we get anxious about not being able to get on top of it, and the cycle goes round and round, and we get epidemics then of anxiety and depression, suicide, addiction, and a lot of that, as Jung would say, is a consequence of the success of our culture. We have given less trust to the mutual shaping of love, less trust to companionship, community, less trust to stability. We're hungry for more knowledge, for more wealth, more happiness, and it gets us into big trouble. And so what Jung was on about makes him countercultural, counter our culture. He's a voice in the wilderness, but he's still there. And I believe he always will be there. And there'll be times when he'll be sought out again and reinterpreted again. Because what he said was such a reminder that we humans are complex, and part of our complexity is that we have conscious and unconscious forces shaping our daily experience. And how do we work with that? And in the clinic, my experience is, yes, if we ignore unconscious forces, all our work is half-baked. But that's my bias.
Yes, and could we have one more contribution here from Sean?
Hi, David. Yeah, I'm not very clear on this. It's not really a question, but just on that last response you're giving to Robert. You know, people want an answer to the nature of reality, and people who accept secular materialist scientific worldview can only take that as being the answer, whereas people who don't accept that, you know, are going to kind of perhaps take religion literally, or, you know, it seems very hard to accept science and also realise the importance of doing some work, or the importance of what you're talking about, not literally accepting all these things, but symbolically accepting these things as being processes that we need one development to sort of integrate. And I just think it's very hard for people to reconcile the different ways that reality can seem. It seems there isn't one truth. You know, we want to believe there is one truth, but it seems there isn't, and it's hard to. You know.
Yep. Dead right, Shauna, dead right. I can only agree with you. We today are convinced that there's one reality. The one reality is the one we touch and see and talk about, and that's it. And we've convinced ourselves that largely, and it gets us into big trouble. I agree, because my experience is, as is yours, I'm sure, there are multiple realities, and we need to be, as best we can, fluent with as many as possible, because they're our realities. They're part of human experience, us humans, Homo sapiens experience. Okay, that's good. I think I should finish for the night.
Thank you very much, David. It's been absolutely fantastic tonight. I'd like to give our appreciation. There's so much to think about. I think we're going to spend the next month thinking about what we've said tonight. So thank you again. And I'd like
Good.
draw this to a close. You're very welcome to come and have a cup of tea with us, and because we've got some nice goodies for you to have before you leave tonight. So thank you for all coming. I know it's been a big night tonight, and it's been just wonderful having David here with us on the big screen. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Yes, thank you, David. We're looking forward to seeing you in this or some other form along the way as we have in the past.
Okie dokie.
All the best.
Okay, bye-bye now.
Okay.
I'm leaving. Bye-bye.
I was going to say,
Before we're going to sing that.
well, first of all, finish.
No, finish. No.
Yeah, but I just want to say.
Okay.
No, I just wanted to say one thing, that the Melbourne group, the Jungian Society, do believe in Jung very strongly, don't they, Trish? Trish and I are doing a psychology course with Melbourne online, and it's just been great. And they're very much alive with the Jungian concepts. So it's just good to be part of that.
Yeah.
So if anyone